Putin tried to break Ukraine. He expected Kyiv to fall in days. He expected the Ukrainian government to collapse. He expected the country to fracture under the sheer weight of Russia's military power. Instead, the exact opposite happened. Ukraine didn't break. Russia did. Despite launching the largest invasion in Europe since World War II, Moscow has failed to capture Kyiv, failed to topple Ukraine's government, and continues to suffer staggering casualties, economic strain, and growing isolation on the world stage. Ukraine, meanwhile, has only grown stronger, forging powerful alliances, transforming its military, and turning itself into one of the most innovative fighting forces in the world. Putin certainly never saw this coming when he gave the green light for his so-called special military operation back in February of 2022. Back then, he had a clear plan of action and firm expectations of how the subsequent days, weeks and months would pan out. Publicly, he spoke about saving Ukrainians and ethnic Russians from the country's neo-Nazi regime, despite having no credible evidence to back up his claims. He also spoke about taking control of Ukraine's eastern regions, including Donetsk and Luhansk. Privately, however, intelligence reports found that the Kremlin had much bigger plans in mind. It didn't just want to take over parts of Ukraine, it wanted the entire country. Now, before the invasion even began, Russian Federal Security Service (FSB) agents were eyeing up apartments in Kyiv, putting their pieces in position for a complete breakdown of Ukraine's government. Once the country's president, Volodymyr Zelensky, was removed from power, the Kremlin would install its own puppet government, turning Ukraine from a free and independent nation in charge of its own destiny into another Russian vassal state, like Belarus. Many expected Russia would get what it wanted. The sheer weight and size of the Russian army would surely prove too much for Ukraine to bear, and even if Kyiv mustered some sort of defense, it would only be a matter of time until its fortifications were smashed and Moscow got exactly what it wanted. In short, Ukraine was supposed to be annihilated, broken down, bit by bit, before being pieced back together exactly as Vladimir Putin saw fit. Russia, meanwhile, was supposed to emerge victorious and triumphant into a new era of even greater power and influence. Then there was Putin himself. There's no doubt he saw his special military operation as the chance to cement his legacy, to go down in history as a tactical genius and perhaps Russia's greatest ever leader. He already evidently sees himself as some sort of modern-day Peter the Great, and the conquest of Ukraine would, once and for all, solidify his reputation as perhaps the most powerful man on the planet. From there, there's evidence to suggest that Russia might have had additional plans, with the Kremlin potentially plotting additional invasions of former Soviet republics, or even an attack on NATO, which remains a very real possibility to this day. But now, years after the invasion began, it's clear to see. Moscow's plan didn't merely backfire, it went dramatically wrong in almost every conceivable way. Ukraine didn't break. Its government didn't collapse, its people didn't wave the white flag, and its defenses didn't fall apart in the wake of the Russian army's attacks. That's not to say that the country didn't suffer. Ukraine has endured terrible, unprecedented losses. It's withstood intensive and persistent bombing and drone attacks. It has seen its towns and cities wiped off the map. It's lost approximately 20% of its territory to Russia, and its people have been the victim of atrocious war crimes like the horrific Bucha massacre, in which innocent civilians were slaughtered in the streets and tortured at the hands of heartless Russian soldiers. Yet, through it all, Ukraine has never given up. Its people never bent the knee, nor did they celebrate the Russian army's arrival with flowers and cheers, as some Kremlin officials foolishly believed they would. Instead, many of them took up arms, banded together, and defended their land with unimaginable courage. Faced with the prospect of a potential genocide and the complete erasure of their culture, freedoms, and way of life, they rose up. They refused to allow Russia to simply cannibalize their country, putting their own lives on the line in defense of their country. Many experts and analysts have attributed the incredible defense of Ukraine to the innate resilience of its people. But that's a very simple and even shallow way of summing up a much greater, deeper, and more complex concept. Resilience has played a huge part in the defense of Ukraine, without a doubt. But the country's survival and subsequent fight back demanded much more than that. It required an immense amount of strategic planning, careful resource management, shrewd political ingenuity, and military innovation for this nation, which is so much smaller than its enemy, to stand up and defend itself as successfully as it has. Ukraine has also had to be able to respond and adapt rapidly to the crises and challenges imposed by the war. It hasn't had the luxury of time or the freedom to spend days and weeks debating big decisions or mulling over possible tactics. It's been forced to act almost on instinct, and that was something that the country learned very early on. Indeed, mere days into the full-scale invasion, Ukraine was faced with a stark and brutal reality: act or die. Survival required speed, clarity, and unity of command. The country had spent several decades since the collapse of the Soviet Union establishing democratic institutions and decentralizing authority, but all of that had to be put on the back burner. An immediate and dramatic recalibration was required. Decisions needed to be made more quickly, and there was no room for red tape and bureaucracy to get in the way when so many lives and the very future of Ukraine were at stake. With Russian forces advancing rapidly and missile strikes threatening major cities, any delay, disruption, or hesitation could have been fatal. As a result, the Zelensky government soon became much more hierarchical. This wasn't Ukraine abandoning democracy, it was in fact the only viable way to protect it. While Russia had hoped that the strength and swiftness of its attack would confuse or even paralyze the Ukrainian government to the point of collapse, the opposite occurred instead. Kyiv's leadership adapted. It made the necessary changes, consolidating authority, centralizing command, and coordinating its military maneuvers. But this concentration of power has also raised concerns about democratic oversight and institutional independence during wartime. Russia saw a weakness, but Ukraine turned it into a strength. Then it went further. It built bonds with new allies across the Western world, strengthening relationships with nations like the United States, United Kingdom, France, Germany, the Scandinavian nations, Poland, and others, acquiring the financial, military, and humanitarian support it needed not just to survive, but to strike back at its enemy. It also worked hard at developing its own domestic defense industry, with dozens of new companies springing up to design and develop new weapons, drones, air defenses, and other assets, many of which have proven vital and valuable in the fight to defend Ukraine and damage Russia. One step at a time, Ukraine set about building the strongest, most fearsome military force in all of Europe. This shouldn't have been able to happen. Ukraine didn't have the same sort of budget, means, manpower, or resources as European powerhouses like France, Germany, and the UK. Yet, in many metrics, it has since surpassed them all, defying odds and shattering expectations over and over again. Now, before the war began, Ukraine was certainly not regarded as any sort of major military power, nor would its name come up in discussions of the most important and influential countries in Europe. Now, it's a major player, not just in the military world, but on the global geopolitical stage. Funnily enough, this is exactly what Ukrainian patriots and nationalists had wanted to see happen for decades, and it took a Russian president, Putin, to make their dreams come true. Those same patriots also dreamed of seeing their country come together and the Ukrainian people united at last, standing side by side for a common cause. That prayer too was answered by Putin. Prior to the war, the Ukrainian people, much like plenty of other populations around the world, had diverse views regarding their country's leadership, their relationship with Russia, and their place on the world stage. But when war comes along, there's no room for fence-sitting. People are forced to pick a side, and Putin made that decision incredibly easy for the Ukrainian people. Many of them had friends and family in Russia, and had spent much of their lives seeing the country in a relatively favorable light. The invasion changed all that. Suddenly, Russia was an aggressor, an invader, an enemy. Thanks to Putin, a country and people that many Ukrainians at least respected, if not admired, was turned overnight into its greatest nemesis. The Ukrainian people, meanwhile, largely put aside their differences, banding together as brothers and sisters in arms against a common foe. And while Ukraine grew stronger, Russia began to crumble. Now, you're watching The Military Show, and if you haven't subscribed yet, now's the time. Ukraine could have simply rolled over and fallen under Russia's control. It didn't. And today, it's a much stronger, more powerful, and more inspiring presence on the world stage than at any other point in its history. Tragically, tens of thousands of its people have been killed to reach this point, but it continues to show those same qualities of grit, determination, resilience, and adaptability that have fueled its astonishing ascent since 2022. Russia, meanwhile, has gone in the exact opposite direction. Before the war began, Russia was seen as one of the most fearsome, formidable nations on Earth. Everyone, even the world's mightiest military powers, was concerned about the prospect of war with Russia, and many feared that if and when Putin gave the order to attack, almost no nation would be able to stand in its way. They foresaw the mighty Russia war machine rampaging across Europe, taking territory and subjugating all enemies in its way by force, with an almost endless supply of troops, tanks and armoured vehicles proving too much for anyone to handle. But the war with Ukraine has shattered the myth of Russian might. It's revealed the weakness of its army, the incompetence of its commanders, and the desperation of its leadership. And while Ukraine has suffered terrible loss of life, there's at least an argument that those people died for a cause. Russia, meanwhile, has lost people in far greater numbers, with estimates suggesting that the country has crossed the miserable milestone of more than 1.25 million casualties in total, with several 100,000 soldiers killed in action and countless more wounded so severely that they'll never be able to be fit to return to the battlefield. Those soldiers didn't die for some grand cause. They didn't lay their lives on the line so that Russian forces could make great gains, capture important towns and cities, and push on towards a historic victory. In fact, the charts show that Russia today holds barely a fraction more land in Ukraine than it did back in 2022, the year the war began. What's more, the country's forces are moving at such a slow pace, trading dozens or even hundreds of lives for the tiniest, most meaningless patches of land, that it would take decades of effort and unimaginable losses for them to even get close to their end goal of conquering the country in its entirety. Even in the areas where Russia has amassed the biggest numbers of troops and exerted the most aggression, its rate of progress remains embarrassing. For example, between February 2024 and January 2026, Russian troops advanced a little less than 50 kilometers from Avdiivka to Pokrovsk. That's a rate of around 70 meters per day, which is slower than the Allied forces' rate of progress during the famous Battle of the Somme in World War I. Even with today's modern technology and tactics, plus its massive manpower advantage, Russia isn't even managing to match the kind of gains seen a century ago. Its offensives in other areas have been even slower and less efficient, with vast numbers of soldiers being killed for almost zero gains on the ground. What's more, even when Russia does manage to make gains, all it's usually doing is taking over pointless pieces of territory that have been absolutely blown to bits by artillery fire, drones, bombs and mines, or tiny abandoned settlements filled with wreckage, rubble, and the charred, smouldering remains of former homes and structures. In short, the country isn't getting anything out of this war, but it's paying a remarkably high price by keeping it going in four all-important areas: casualties, the economy, public opinion, and world standing. Let's look at each of those in turn, beginning with casualties. As mentioned earlier, Russia has suffered enormous losses. It's crossed milestone over milestone, losing 100,000 of its troops, then 200,000, 500,000, a million, and the number keeps rising. To put those losses into context, Russia has suffered several times more casualties in its war with Ukraine than in every other war it's been involved in since the end of the Second World War. That includes the two Chechen wars, the Soviet Union's 10-year war with Afghanistan, and additional conflicts in places like Korea, Hungary, and Czechoslovakia. Even if you add up all of the Russian and Soviet soldiers killed and wounded in those conflicts, it pales in comparison to the losses Putin has now inflicted on his army. For a time, those losses, while dramatic, were still sustainable to an extent. Even if Russia lost 30,000 troops in a single month, it was able to recruit 30,000 more to replace them. But that's all starting to change. The latest reports show that Russia is increasingly unable to recruit the people it needs to cover up and counteract its losses. Its army is no longer growing and is instead set to start shrinking as the war rages on. When it comes to the economy too, Russia is in a death spiral. Having spent extravagant amounts on its military-industrial complex, pouring billions and billions into recruitment drives, drone production plants, soldier salaries, procurement, missiles, development projects and more, the country has depleted its national wealth fund. It's also suffered the increasingly crippling effects of Western sanctions, which have only grown more severe and intense as time has gone by. Ukraine too has played its part, using drone warfare to wipe out high-value targets across Russia's territory, plunging the country into a costly fuel crisis, which it's still struggling to navigate. All of these issues have added up, taking an unprecedented toll on Russia's once strong economy. While Moscow was able to withstand the early stages of sanctions and other economic impacts of the war, it's really feeling the heat now. Foreign investment has been slashed, with fewer and fewer countries willing to do business with Putin, the warmonger. Long-term productivity prospects appear increasingly bleak, thanks to the country's worsening labour shortage, and Russia's GDP growth has swiftly declined, reaching almost stagnation level. Plus, the country is so busy pouring around half of its budget into the armed forces and defence contracts, it's falling rapidly behind in other important areas like AI and emerging technologies. So, even if the war miraculously ended, Russia would still find itself lagging dangerously behind other world powers, becoming increasingly irrelevant as the years go by. And with an economy over 13 times smaller than the United States and about 8 times smaller than China's, Russia still has a massive amount of catching up to do if it ever wants to be taken seriously as a superpower again. Putin has also seen his stock with the Russian public plummet in the years since the war began. While many Russians have had variable views of their president during his more than 20 years in power, a large part of the population at least respected him or felt that he was the right man for the unenviable task of presiding over such a vast landmass. His decisions to start a war with Ukraine, a country that many Russians viewed as a fraternal and friendly neighbour, and to persist with that war year after year, despite heavy losses and no notable gains, have caused a massive shift in the national mood. Estimates suggest that up to 1 million Russians have left the country since the war began, with many feeling utterly ashamed of their president's actions. Some have even taken up arms against their motherland, siding with the Ukrainians and supporting their cause. Among those that remain in Russia, opinions have slowly but surely turned against the Kremlin, with an increasing majority of people eager to see an end to the fighting at last. Many Russians have felt the effects of the war firsthand. They've lost friends, neighbours and family members in the conflict, or witnessed the gradual degradation of their country and the loss of former liberties as everything from internet access to international travel has been restricted for them. Far from going down in history as the 21st century's Peter the Great, Putin now runs the risk of becoming the most hated ruler in Russia's long and storied history. He's also managed to diminish his country's standing on the world stage like never before. Perhaps he expected other nations to be too frightened or overwhelmed to stand against him. Instead, large parts of the world have wholeheartedly shunned Russia, severing diplomatic and business ties, cancelling imports and exports, tearing up agreements, and strengthening connections with other, better allies instead. Even those countries that were historically the closest to Russia, like many of the former Soviet republics, have turned their backs on it, leaving Moscow with a tiny pool of potential allies to call on, including China, Iran, and North Korea. With trade, investment, and support all slipping, the country's crises are only going to get worse from here on out. All of Putin's dreams went up in smoke, and his worst nightmares came to life instead. His allies and influence slowly disappeared, his people turned against him, his economy crumbled, and his legacy went with it. Meanwhile, Ukraine galvanized, NATO strengthened, and the world woke up to the reality that Russia, in fact, wasn't as scary and strong as it had always appeared. Putin has no one to blame for this mess but himself. He held the shovel, he dug the hole, and now he's in far too deep to have any hope of climbing back out. Now, learn more about Russia's historic losses in this video, which looks at how Putin has effectively sent an entire generation of his country's men to their deaths. Or check out our detailed breakdown of how Ukraine is gearing up for a gigantic de-Russification campaign, forcing the enemy out of its territory once and for all. And finally, don't forget to subscribe to the channel too, for more insights and analysis just like this.